Warning, this video will contain spoilers for the first film and trailer for the second film of Rosa of the Recapture. If you don't want spoilers, then wait until the 21st of June when the anime comes out on Disney+. Many of the ideas I discuss in this video are merely theories and should not be taken as canon. Well, the trailer for the second film in Rosa of the Recapture came out with the biggest reveal yet, that the Damocles and the Fleija warheads are back. This wasn't a new revelation for me, since they gave away the return of the Damocles in the exclusive trailer, but I didn't think they would use the Damocles in the same way, and boy was I wrong. Considering people weren't happy with how the initial plot reveal potentially ruined the Zero Requiem, this is going to make things appear even worse. I say appear because maybe it could work. So in this video, I will go over 4 major problems with reintroducing the Damocles and the Fleija and ways to work around them if possible. Starting with problem number 1. How did they rebuild it? This would require material resources and the knowledge to accomplish this. I assumed after the Zero Requiem, they destroyed the plans to create the Damocles alongside the Fleijas. Otherwise, what's the point of sending the first one in the sun if the information to make more still exists? That goes double for the Fleijas themselves. It would make sense for the UFN to create regulations on creating weapons like the Fleija or the Damocles as another safeguard. This isn't a stretch, since sending the Damocles into the sun is proof that they consider it to be a global threat that has no place in this world. Now for the second part, the resources. The Damocles is a gigantic air fortress created by the Totem Agency under Schneisel's orders. Given its scope and specs, it was most likely a costly investment, both with money and the actual materials to build it. Since Neo Britannia seems like a small up-and-coming nation based on their primitive nightmare frames, it wouldn't be a stretch to assume that they don't have the resources to build it, or I should say rebuild it, and that also would include hiring a company to do it. Their base of operations is one location in Japan. Even Horai Island was a bigger location, and India was supporting the Black Knights. That's what makes that situation believable, and this one not so much. Creating the Fleijas could have similar problems if they are working from scratch, since they would need a large area to test them. Regardless if they had the knowledge to make them, mass producing the weapon would also require Sakuradite and other rare resources. Keep in mind that Lush destroyed the Sakuradite mines in Mount Fuji, which supplied 70% of the world's supply. Although given what we see in Resurrection, I wonder if the impact of that wasn't as large as many suspected it would be. Anyways, let's address these problems. A simple explanation is that the plans weren't destroyed, but locked away in a secret location, maybe for a worst-case scenario situation. Then Neo Britannia stole the plans either through some undercover operatives or other means. Keeping the plans for the Fleija could explain why Nina improved the Fleija Eliminator. Or maybe just as Lloyd and Rakshata improved the nightmare frames, despite living in the miraculous tomorrow, she wanted to do the same thing for the Eliminator. Perhaps it's part of her atonement. Another possibility is that the former members of the Totem Agency and the Vogue research team are assisting Neo Britannia. The Vogue team created the Fleijas, in case you forgot. They would of course have to explain why they are assisting Neo Britannia to begin with. This also assumes that the scientists on the Vogue team could recreate the Fleija without Nina's help if they were working from scratch. Now, if Norlon turned out to be Schneisel, or Schneisel was revealed to be working with them, then that would explain the Totem Agency's connection, or this whole thing in general. Remember, Schneisel said they could get others to build Fleijas, and I assume other Damocles as well, and this was when they were going to abandon the first one. So the knowledge gap doesn't seem that problematic, but what about the material resources? The simple explanation for that is that the Hokkaido block had the resources to create a Damocles, or they brought it with them during the initial occupation of the Hokkaido block, most likely in waves. Since they kept the occupation going for over 4 years, the Black Knights probably didn't seize the area and prevent resources from going in and out. This does bring up problems that I will discuss later on. Another important consideration is the fact that this Damocles isn't isn't a perfect recreation of the original. It doesn't seem to have the blaze luminous system and might not be able to ascend beyond the mountain base, meaning it didn't require as many resources as the original one. Maybe the Fleija fired in the trailer was only one of a handful that they could make, unlike before, where Schneisel seemed to have an unlimited supply. And as I said earlier, based on the Lush of the Resurrection, they could have found other sources of Securidite around the world, or found ways to be more efficient with the smaller supply. Either way, we don't know exactly what the situation is, so it's hard to judge if they have the necessary resources to recreate the Damocles without some of its main functionality. Although I have to ask, if it can't achieve air superiority, why even build it at all? Wouldn't using a simple cannon, like what we see in Akito the Exile, to fire the Fleijas make more sense? They are targeting ghettos, not the world. And if they want to take over the world, they couldn't anyways, based on the problems with this Damocles. But back to other methods available to deliver the Fleija. Remember that Suzaku fired a Fleija during the Battle of Tokyo 2 using the Lancelot Conquista. So any Nightmare frame in theory could use the weapon. It isn't tied to the Damocles. Schneisel only used the Damocles to make bombing the world easier, and it's quite deadly when battling whole armies in the sky. Explaining how and why they rebuilt this is going to be the largest hurdle for this film. If it's anything like the barrier surrounding the Hokkaido block explanation, then prepare for disappointment. Moving on to problem number 2, which relates to problem number 1. Why is this thing a threat, and why did no one stop its production? If the Damocles doesn't have a blaze luminous shield, then it's a sitting duck. The modern Nightmare frames in Resurrection should have no issues taking it out. They could also use the cannon shown in Akito the Exile to attack it from a safe distance, or the weapon Jun used to give Shin cover. Remember, the production of this took years, and there's no way they kept it a secret given the size of it. They should have been able to find it with satellites or using the simple eye test. In the exclusive trailer, you can see the Damocles from the distance on the mountain. There should be enough time for the Black Knights to prepare countermeasures to destroy it. Just get Zaku, Colin, Toto, Gino, Alderin, Cornelia, and so forth down to Japan, give them powerful 7th generation Nightmare frames, and the problem is solved. Considering how old the Damocles is, even if it had a blaze luminous shield, I'm sure the combined intelligence of Rakshata, Lloyd, Cecile, Anna, Sophie, and Miss X could come up with a countermeasure for it. They didn't have the time in the original anime, but here it's been 7 years. And here's why I don't think the Damocles has a blaze luminous shield. In the trailer, we see Nightmare frames fighting on the Damocles and Rosa flying towards it in the Z Artemis. The battle starts during the day and continues into night, and the Nightmare frames have no issues landing on it or attacking it. This wouldn't have been possible if it had the blaze luminous shield. You can't use the Hokkaido block barrier as an explanation here, since the Nightmare frames are able to engage with the Damocles, meaning that the Gavion Disturber isn't affecting them. That's what opens the door to bring the powerful Nightmare frames and their pilots to take out this new Damocles. This of course is only a possibility if they don't prevent the recreation of the Damocles to begin with, which shouldn't have been that difficult. From the images online, the Hokkaido block is on an island, so they could have sieged it using the airships from R2. They could allow necessary things like food, but not materials used for Nightmare frames to go in. Considering that the Damocles is a global threat, the first sign of its creation should have resulted in the UFN taking immediate action. I can't think of a bigger problem that would require their attention from something like this. It's insulting that the Black Knights are relying on a small resistance group to stop a global threat when the Lush had to use the entire Britannia military to stop it during the Zero Requiem. In Resurrection, they sent in hundreds of ships and Vincentvards to Zilkstan to rescue Nutley and Zero. Admittedly, this was overkill. Comparatively, this conflict is larger, but has a smaller response. All these are serious problems, but here's how it could work. The only way the Black Black Knights need the 7 stars to handle this is if they are dealing with something on the same level or worse, meaning there's another war going on during this and they can't spare the resources to deal with it. That's why they have Nina working with them, creating the improved Fleija Eliminator. What could that greater conflict be? I have no idea. Maybe they are fighting the other nations that broke off from Britannia. According to Lloyd, there were war-torn areas, although I didn't get the impression that anything even close to a Zilkstan level threat still existed. Keep in mind, this conflict occurred 1 year after the events of Lelouch of the Resurrection. It is also possible that they weren't building the Fleija or the Damocles in the Hokkaido block. Instead, they brought the components to the Hokkaido block following its completion. So by the time they put it together, the Black Knights had days, not years, to figure out on how to stop it. Neo Britannia would have to keep the construction a secret, which would have been difficult but not impossible. I could still have an issue with them transporting it without arousing suspicion unless they brought it during the initial occupation when no one knew what was going on. Although you can still argue that with advanced satellite technology and powerful nightmare frames, how exactly does that happen? We will need some clarification here. This is a delicate situation because the explanation could end up showcasing the incompetence of the Black Knights, the UFN, and ultimately Lelouch, which I'll get to later. And by later, I mean now, as we discuss problem number 3, where Rosa of the Recapture once again invalidates the Zero Requiem by making Lelouch a failure and possibly an idiot. In a previous video, I discussed how a recent conflict could invalidate the Zero Requiem. That's of course this one. But this situation is worse. While Lelouch's goal was to give humanity the chance to create a better future, the motivation behind accomplishing this goal was to prevent Schneisel from ruling the world under the fear of Fleijas. Lelouch based his tactics to defeat Schneisel on stopping the Damocles and the Fleijas, yet despite his best efforts, with enough time, someone else could just rebuild it. It renders Lelouch's plan obsolete and brings up his incompetence. I can't believe that Lelouch, one of the smartest characters in Code Geass, a brilliant tactician, couldn't account for this. I assume he gave Suzaku instructions to help prevent this from happening, and given how he used the Damocles to unite the whole world against him, the UFN would have made it a priority to prevent it from ever returning. Nina also seemed devastated by the Fleijas, which motivated her actions to remove them. She would probably also assist in this effort. While I've given explanations for how and why the Damocles could come back, the fact that it does only 7 years after the Zero Requiem proved that Lelouch failed, the UFN failed, Nina failed, and the thousands that sacrificed their lives died in vain. It is the biggest slap in the face to the Zero Requiem that you can do. The only way I can somewhat justify this is if someone removed the Geass on Schneisel and is working against Lelouch, or this conflict is larger than they are leading on and something crazy must have happened following Resurrection. Maybe something that even Lelouch didn't anticipate. But if that or something like that isn't the case and the Neo Britannian forces on their own could recreate the global threat in a short period of time, then it demonstrates the incompetence of everyone. This includes people like Schneisel and Cornelia, both powerhouses equal to Lelouch. I wasn't expecting the effects of the Zero Requiem to last forever, but at least 20 to 40 years where we had the legacy characters running things. But it turns out this whole thing could just be the result of Lelouch overlooking something rather simple and everyone else just being an idiot. I hope I'm wrong on all accounts. Now let's move on to the 4th problem, which is why they included the Damocles in the story. As I already described, its inclusion has created so many narrative problems, but they had to go a step further and even recreate Suzaku and Lelouch's incredible moment when they stopped the Fleija. They do this with Ash and Rosa. I am not upset that they no longer need someone on Lelouch's or Suzaku's level to use the Fleija Eliminator because Nina probably improved the design and had over 7 years to do this. The problem is copying this moment without understanding why it worked in the original anime and why it doesn't here. Simply put, there's no setup for this. The moment where Lelouch and Suzaku stopped the Fleija was amazing because it showcased their unity. They had become one, and that means something considering they've been enemies for most of the series. There's also the idea that Zaku acted to redeem himself. The same man who fired the first Fleija worked to stop the firing of another, an event that led to the fall of the Damocles and the removal of all the remaining Fleijas. The stakes were higher as well, as it was the final battle. Schneizel, through destroying Lelouch and his forces, would secure his dominance over the world. Contrast that with Rosa, and you can see why it doesn't work here. This is only the 4th, possibly 5th episode, however they decide to handle the Damocles in the next film, and Ash and Rosa don't have the same chemistry as Lelouch and Suzaku. In fact, Rosa forced Ash to work with her, so it doesn't have the same impact. Now, if this was later on in the series, and Ash was no longer under Rosa's Geass, the two reconciled their difference and then worked together, well, that would have been different. But instead, it's just two people we barely know with no real chemistry working together and failing to recreate the soul of this iconic moment. And just like how Revenge of the Sith showcased similar imagery and themes in the beginning that we saw at the end of Return of the Jedi, Rosa showcasing the removal of the Fleija near the beginning when Lelouch and Suzaku took it out during the final battle. Doing this is confusing, feels forced, and doesn't have the same impact in both cases. I get the impression that they're only using the Damocles as a stepping stone to prop up the real threat, which downplays Lelouch's efforts, making everything feel pointless, as I already discussed. I always had issues with stories doing this to raise the stakes, because there are other ways you can prop up a new threat without using this method. But these 4 issues are a symptom of a much grander problem. They want to tell stories in a post-Zero Requiem world. The question is, how do you do that without invalidating the Zero Requiem? Resurrection accomplished this by creating a conflict in a new nation that relied on warfare to survive as their main source of their economy. The conflict itself didn't ruin the Zero Requiem, as it showcased how the UFN and the Black Knights worked together to end the conflict. Even Zilkstan joined the UFN, which only could happen thanks to Lelouch's efforts. Here, it's like they've given up and decide to work towards undoing the entire Zero Requiem. Of course, this isn't required to create stories in a post-Zero Requiem world. It is, however, the best option to go with if you're looking for a quick, lazy, and simple answer. Just recycle things from the past and, well, remove the Zero Requiem.
What? Oh, just rebuild it? Oh, that's real f***ing original.
Instead, all they had to do was tell smaller scale stories in new locations. This is why C2 and Lelouch going after the Geass users would have been a perfect sequel series. Doing the opposite has led us to this moment. It would be fine if this took place 50 to 100 years later with a brand new generation of characters, but of course that didn't happen, probably because they can't let Lelouch go. Although he is immortal and would still be around by then. And if they don't intend to use much of the legacy characters, which remains to be seen, is there really any difference between having the story take place 3 to 4 years after Resurrection or 50 years? They had so many options and they chose to do this. It's a damn shame, because outside of stupid shit like this, most of this series seemed promising. The characters are likable and unique, the main story has nice twists, and for the most part feels like a proper Code Geass series, but these positives are met with so many negatives, including the Hokkaido block occupation explanation, the use of old technology, and finding more ways to undo the Zero Requiem. And despite my issues, I'm glad they actually finished this project. And as I've said before, much of this is speculation, as I hope they will resolve these issues when it comes out. That's why I'm making these videos now, so I can compare my initial thoughts to the reveals. I'm going to keep my expectations low and hope for the best, and I recommend you do the same. The series has surprised me before, and maybe will again. Let me know your thoughts on the return of the Damocles. Is it a lazy plot device that invalidates the Zero Requiem, or a brilliant idea that will be a smaller part of a grander scheme? And if you want more videos like this, then check out my one where I recap the first film of Rosa of the Recapture.